Hello everyone, how are you going this morning? Good. My name's Kenyon, I'm with the mission team from ANU Focus from Canberra. I'm currently studying engineering and finance. In finance, we look at how to apply financial instruments to the markets. And in engineering, we look at how to apply our knowledge of systems to better the world. So I'm going to try and illuminate how we can apply a God-centered thinking to our lives as workers for Christ. While building a bridge, you might save a few minutes of travel time, or buying a share, you might earn a few dollars, or a few thousand if you're lucky. But applying godly values to our lives correctly will have eternal ramifications, both for us and for others. This is especially hard in a society that tells us how we should be doing things and how we should not be doing things. The passage that I'll be looking at today is Daniel, specifically how he responds to challenging circumstances. You see, he knew that God was in control and God's commands trump any value system that the world could throw at him. As I moved to Canberra to study at ANU, I arrived at a large student residence of over 400 students. I was walking back to my accommodation from a study session and noticed a poster on a bridge that I walked across to get home. ANU is covered in posters, they're absolutely everywhere, and I sometimes stop to look at them. It's probably not the best idea. Anyway, this poster read, "No homophobia, no transphobia, no religious exemptions." I looked on their Facebook page because I'm curious, again, not the best thing to do, and it said, "Those opposing their ideas were nothing more than a bitter and vicious conservative minority attempting to roll back progress." You see, society was trying to tell me and trying to tell all you as Christians what we should do, how we should act, and what we should not do. However, we know that our values should stem from God and not our own thinking. If you're familiar with the book of Daniel, then you know how he stood up for his faith amidst great persecution and great pressure from society and his superiors. Daniel knew that while King Nebuchadnezzar was in command of Babylon, God was in command of everything. Although it's not as easy as it seems. You can't just stand up and tell everybody, "No, you're wrong, you have to believe this." That's a great way to make enemies, lose friends, and possibly even lose your job if you're working. So how do we spread the gospel when everyone is telling us that what we think is wrong? How do we stand up for our beliefs without losing our job? Why should we even care? If someone is sinning, what difference does it make if we tell them or not? Daniel is faced with a similar dilemma when he's taken away from his home during the mighty conquests of King Nebuchadnezzar through Assyria, Egypt, and Jerusalem to expand the Babylonian Empire. He selected a few Jews to work as a servant for him. Among them was Daniel and 3 others who were given the names Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Once Daniel was brought to Babylon, he was stripped of his manhood and identity. Remember, this was a kid that was only about 15 years old and travelled like 1,000 kilometres away from his home. We travelled from Canberra down to here, and we only travelled like 650, so it puts it into perspective how big of a journey that was, considering he was only so young. This is a time when Daniel couldn't appeal to some human rights commission or lawyers or government intervention like we can today. He was truly on his own. King Nebuchadnezzar was accountable to nobody and had total control over what happened to Daniel, or so it would seem. The knowledge that even the mighty conqueror, King Nebuchadnezzar, was under God's control drove Daniel to remain faithful. It wasn't King Nebuchadnezzar that Daniel should be afraid of, disobeying, but God. Once Daniel was at Babylon, he was put through a 3-year scheme. This is in page 625 if you want to open it up. With the aim of stripping him of his past identity and any religious beliefs. They wanted him to conform with their society, with their way of doing things, just as society is trying to do to us today at times. We see in Daniel 1, verse 8 to 16, that Daniel was told that he must eat the royal food and wine that was offered to idols. However, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, when he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Notice how Daniel approached this problem. He was asked to do something that did not align with our values. Any of us get asked this at work or at school or wherever. He didn't publicly reject the food. He asked the guard for permission not to eat the food and wine in a secret manner, not proclaiming, "Oh, I'm this mighty, Christian that knows everything." He did it quietly and he did it respectfully. Daniel offered himself as a sacrifice, as a safeguard, so that if he was weaker than the other men, the guard looking over him could kill him and not be killed himself. If he was weaker than the other men because the guard refused to give him food, then the guard would definitely be killed. So he said, "Why don't you kill me instead of being killed yourself?" When I first arrived at my university residence, my room was next to a transgender student and across from a gender-neutral bathrooms, and it was drilled into us that this is a diverse and inclusive space. Within my hall, there was basically no other Christians. This was a big change from my Pentecostal high school where pretty much everyone was a Christian, no one questioned anything, and everyone believed the same thing. Because we were all so close together in my college, any differences in values is noticed by everyone. Another byproduct of being at university is that everyone is very intellectual and naturally wants to challenge and critique any sort of new theories that they come across. So my Christianity was obviously the big new theory that they could challenge. So I've had lots and lots of conversations with atheists and other people about what I believe, why I'm a Christian, and what I'm all about. While no one explicitly says, stop being a Christian, just being around so many non-Christians represents another way of life. Maybe you might have the same thing at work or school. Everyone else is a non-Christian. Why don't I just do what they're doing? Everyone else is doing it. So for the first time in my life, I sort of started to question everything. And it made sense since everything I believed was being questioned. When Daniel arrived at a somewhat foreign place, not only were his beliefs questioned, but they were also rebuked. His approach wasn't to stand up and denounce their customs or ridicule the worshipping of other gods. He instead stayed faithful to his values without drawing too attention to himself. Why did Daniel do this? Why did he remain faithful to godly values? Doesn't everyone have different values? If godly values were just something that someone thought up and decided, oh, that's pretty good, that seems to work, then yeah, Daniel could have just changed his values like a lot of people do in our society. But these values came from God himself. They don't change, and they're perfect. So Daniel understood this, and he knew that godly values weren't up for debate. They were set in stone, and they were complete. God reigns over the whole universe, so his values are kind of a big deal. So God worked through Daniel, and he ended up being stronger than the other servants. But after he proved the guard wrong, again, didn't brag to himself, he didn't tell everyone, oh look, I won, I'm better, I'm right. Even during his troubles, and also his triumphs, he remained respectful. This is how I think we should act when we are challenged about our beliefs or told that things conflict with our values and stuff. When we're put in a new environment and we can see people doing non-godly things all around us, we shouldn't publicly condemn them or tell them, no, you have to act in a certain way. In 1 Peter 3 verse 15 we read, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for your hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. Daniel didn't walk up to King Nebuchadnezzar once he'd gained his trust and say, mate, you have to believe in God, otherwise you're going to hell. Instead, he displayed godly values and let God do the rest. I think this is the better approach. When Jesus came down to earth, he was also graceful and respectful. And of course, he's the perfect example of how we should act. So Daniel continued to act in a godly manner, and in the process he rose to a position of power under King Nebuchadnezzar, as his God-given wisdom and knowledge was realized. This is in page 630 if you also want to turn to that. This can be most amply seen in his ability to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. Nebuchadnezzar saw firsthand the power of God when he threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the furnace, and saw that they remained absolutely untouched by the flames. Then Nebuchadnezzar promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and praised their God. But after King Nebuchadnezzar's son, called Belshazzar, was killed by Darius, Daniel was faced with another challenge. This is in chapter 6. The administrators tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel and his conduct of government affairs. But it says in verse 4, they could not find corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. So they basically set him up. So if they caught him praying to another god, they will have grounds to capture him. Daniel knew this, and despite this, he continued to pray as he usually did. In chapter 6, verse 10, now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room, where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he has done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. After this, he was thrown into the lion's den. How easy would it have been for Daniel to skip prayer a few times? I'm sure everyone, including me, does that regularly. He knew that the administrators were trying to capture him, so all he had to do was not pray for a while. I remember one time when I was at the pub with the boys from soccer, my coach overheard that I was a Christian and asked why. So for the next hour or two, we discussed the Christian beliefs and where we both differ on those beliefs. It's at a university. Everyone has like 2-hour conversations about everything under the face of the earth, and Christian beliefs tend to come up for me. Towards the end of our conversation, he said to me this: I think the values of Christianity are good, but I think they were just meant as guidelines. Why do people take them too seriously? This sentiment was mirrored by another friend, who actually is a Christian, he says. I shouldn't let it rule my life. There are plenty of other important things to be worried about than Christian values. Coming from an atheist culture, this makes absolutely perfect sense. Why would you put all your eggs in the one basket? But as we know as Christians, there isn't anything more important than Christ, so things are a bit different for us. If God reigns, if his ways are perfect, then we have assurance that the values we as Christians strive for are worth much more than any other values that the world has come up with. Society will add values and take them away, but God, his values never change. As a result, when we are faced with challenges to our faith, or tempted to do questionable things, we should stand firm to our beliefs. Daniel could have easily rationalized not praying like any of us would rationalize not coming to church one day because we're sick or tired or whatever else we tend to use as an exception. But when society pushes us to say certain things, to do certain things, to think a certain way, we can't just give in. We can't just change our values. We can't make exceptions for our values and faith. I know that many people try and defend their Christianity. They'll say that they're a Christian. They'll tell you all about it. And then the next day, they'll go and get drunk the next night, or they'll do ungodly things. And I think most of us do something similar. No one's morally perfect, and most of us, I think, have 1 or 2 areas in our life where we just make exceptions. We just say, oh, it's alright, I'll just do it once, I'll just do it twice. At the end of the day, these aren't just guidelines, and we can't just pick and choose the ones that we think are easiest or best. We must try and maintain a godly character in all aspects of our life. I want to explore an instance in the 4 Gospel accounts where Peter denies that he knew Jesus 3 times. This is in Matthew 26:69, which we heard this morning, on page 704. While he truly believed that he would never fall away from Jesus, even if everyone else did, the heat of the moment was too much and Peter gave in to the easy route. After Jesus was arrested and taken away to the high priest's house, Peter followed from a distance. Surrounded by a small crowd, he asked if he knew Jesus. Again, the easy option would have just been to deny Jesus and say he didn't know him and avoid being probably killed by the group. Peter may have stumbled and his values may not have been set on God. But after Jesus' resurrection, there was no denying that Jesus was Lord. The disciples went out after that into the world to be persecuted for their faith. They remained extremely faithful in their godly values because they knew the power and authority of Jesus. We also know the power and authority of Jesus, so we also have a reason to stand firm in our faith. There have been many times when I've been hanging out with a group of people that aren't the most supportive towards Christians. I find myself using ambiguous words, not to draw attention towards my Christian faith. I suppose at work the same thing would be true, not to stand out as a Christian or be different. Rather than giving into the pressure of a crowd like Peter did, I think we should adopt Daniel's approach of standing firm in our belief, but also being respectful and believing in a purposeful manner. Just by watching the news or walking down the street, it's impossible not to notice how society is changing, and I think we can all agree it's, for the most part, it's not changing for the best. Many loaded issues are debated like abortion and personal truth and whatever else they come up with. This is just a facade for a counter-authoritarian value system. At university, everyone hates authority. They hate big companies, they hate big corporations, and they hate the church. So one of the primary authorities that society sees as limiting progress or enforcing outdated beliefs is, of course, Christianity. Despite this backlash aimed at religion, it's extremely important that we as Christians try not to get sucked into this nuanced society that we find ourselves in. The most disastrous thing that we could face is for our members to be willing to make changes to our doctrines just to fit in with culture, just to fit into work, just to fit into university. In this age, it's very easy to justify almost any political or social stance. When I questioned one of my atheist friends who advocates for a subjective morality about his belief, he came up with the most craziest conclusions that we just know aren't true. Believe me, right and wrong are just a blur in most modern society. University has like the most conversations about this, and the things people come up with are absurd sometimes. Almost anything can be justified. I'm saying this because I think it's the primary means that Christians might be tested in their ability to hold on to the faith. Since this talk is about maintaining our faith in our world today, I think it's important that we know how society might come at us, at work or at school. Don't let this happen. Remember, the Word of God was the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Thank you.